Welcome to another edition of the Long Gospel Devotional. My name is Eric Sorensen, and each week we gather to look at God's two words from all of the Scriptures, both His word of law, which tells us what we ought to do and shows us the penalty for having not done it, or for that matter, having done things that we shouldn't do. And of course, His word of gospel, which tells us all that God has done for us, ultimately for us and our salvation through the person and work of Jesus Christ. Well, folks, this week is a special week for 1517 and indeed for all nonprofits across the globe, because this is the week, indeed, by the time this video is released, this is the day that we call Giving Tuesday. And before we get into today's devotion, in which we are actually going to continue our series looking at 1 Corinthians, I did want to take a moment to talk about the significance of Giving Tuesday for a nonprofit organization like ours, like 1517. Of course, the reason that we can provide the content that we do, videos like this, videos like reading the Gospels through Hebrew Eyes with Chad Bird, talks with Dad Rod, and the 20 or so different podcasts, the daily articles, the list could go on and on, the conferences, you name it. The reason we can do all this stuff for the most part for free is because we are, in fact, 100% donor supported. It's true. Everything that we do is offered because of the generosity of donors. And so you know what's coming, folks. I'm going to ask you to consider being one of those donors if you aren't already. Our goal for Giving Tuesday this year is $220,000. That's how much we hope to raise this Giving Tuesday. Thankfully, we've already had $110,000 of that goal pledged to us as matching gifts for the day. And so again, what I'm going to ask of you, at least to consider, is that if you've benefited from the ministry of 1517 in one way or another, that you would consider helping us reach our goal. Our goal, indeed, is not financial. Our goal throughout the year, each and every day, is to declare and defend the good news that we are forgiven and free on account of Christ alone every single day. And your gift helps us do that all around the world. Your gift literally helps us reach people all across the globe. We've got the emails to prove it. We've got the correspondence to prove it. And so we are asking for those of you out there receiving this good news from us to help us continue getting this good news to as many people as possible. If you'd like to do that, please go to www.1517.org/donate and help us reach our goal of $220,000 this Giving Tuesday. We sure appreciate it. All right, let's go ahead and dive into our passage for today. We're continuing on now into the third chapter of 1 Corinthians. And if there's anything that this is really all about, it's about idolatry, although a very specific kind of idolatry. And as John Calvin famously said, the human heart is an idol factory. We are prone to constantly making idols and thereby committing idol worship. Now, what is idolatry? Well, we tend to think of idolatry as bowing down to some sort of statue or object and worship, but actually an idol, biblically speaking, is literally anything one might put ahead of or before God in their life. And if we define idolatry that way, well, then it means even good things can become God things, or at least we treat them like God things. So good things like family and work and food and sex and money and power, all those things are not inherently bad. They're not. Can indeed become idols that rule over us in our lives. You name it, whatever it is, we can find ourselves putting something or someone in the place of God. It's why idolatry tends to manifest itself in various addictions, because idols always overpromise and underdeliver, just as various addictive substances do. I remember hearing a very cogent example of idolatry a little while back from a man named Keith Hudson, who happens to be a pastor, happens to be a traveling preacher, and also happens to be the father of the very well-known singer Katy Perry. And he talked about going to one of her concerts once and seeing these thousands and thousands of fans looking at her with such adoration and feeling immediately terribly convicted, because he realized, as he said, that they were actually worshiping his daughter, that there was actual worship going on. And if any of you have been to a concert of a band that you really like, then you've probably not only seen this happening, but you've probably even been guilty of committing idolatry yourself. I know I have. I know I did when I first saw Weezer for the first time back when I was a huge fanboy in the 90s. So I get it. We're all guilty of it. We all are prone to it. Nevertheless, it's a good thing that we Christians are immune from such problems. Okay, just kidding. No, that's not in any way true whatsoever. No, Paul has to warn Christians against idolatry in various forms and in various fashions because it's a problem for us too. In particular, one form of idolatry that I have seen throughout my life in the ministry, and for that matter outside of the ministry, is something that I've called Pastorology. Now, Morgan Freeman might say to me it's just a made-up word, and indeed that is a made-up word, but nevertheless, my guess is you hear it and you know what I mean. What I mean is that the church, from time to time, has had the tendency to make pastors into idols. They have tended to treat pastors and elevate pastors and platform pastors in such a way that whatever a specific pastor says is basically the same thing as hearing what God has to say. Now, I'm not picking on any people in particular, but let me just give you a few examples of where I've seen people do this with specific teachers. Again, not commenting on these specific teachers. I'm not going to pick on anybody in particular, but of course, the most obvious example throughout history is the way that people have viewed the Pope. Whether it be our current Pope or the Pope, anytime throughout history, there's a tendency to look at him and to replace him with, or to replace God with him. Whatever he says goes. That can be a problem. Or what I saw growing up in Southern California is people sort of falling into the idolatry of a man named Pastor Chuck Smith, the founder of Calvary Chapel. Again, not criticizing Chuck Smith for this, just recognizing that people did make an idol out of him. I think he would have said the same thing. Or in modern times, somebody that people often make an idol out of is a man named John MacArthur. Again, I'm in Southern California, so these are big names in my neck of the woods. I don't know if it translates as much throughout the rest of the country, but there is a tendency for some who follow John MacArthur to think that everything John MacArthur says is in fact Bible. And because he's human, no, that's not the truth. And just so I can be an equal opportunity offender as a Lutheran here, let me acknowledge that there's plenty of Luther-olatry all over the place too. Yes, it happens. Yes, it happens quite a bit. The point is, all of us are prone to building people or things up into idols, and pastors often get put in that place, and they ought not be because there's all sorts of problems with it. For starters, Paul is going to tell us that Pastorology is inevitably divisive. Look at what he says starting off our passage in verse 1. But I, brothers, could not address you as spiritual people, but as people of the flesh, as infants in Christ. I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for it. And even now you are not ready, for you are still of the flesh. For while there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not of the flesh and behaving only in a human way? And what does he give as an example of behaving only in a very human way, in a fleshly way? Well, he says, for when one says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos, are you not being merely human? Yes, Paul's example of their division is of them dividing over who they think is a better pastor or who they think is a more worthy pastor. Paul, Apollos, or for that matter, when you go back to chapter 1, he mentions Peter and even those who say that they are really just followers of Jesus. And as I mentioned when we went over that passage in chapter 1, I don't think that that is being spoken of as a way, as a good thing. I think Paul is actually criticizing people that are saying, I don't need any pastor at all. I just have Jesus. It's just me and my Bible. No creed but Christ. No. That doesn't work either. As he says in that chapter, for it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there is quarreling among you. My brothers, what I mean is that each one of you says, I follow Paul, or I follow Apollos, or I follow Cephas, another name for Peter, or I follow Christ. And his final summation here in verse 13 of chapter 1 is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you, or were you baptized in the name of Paul? And of course, it's a series of rhetorical questions that we know the obvious answer to. No, Paul was not crucified for you, and no one is saved by Paul or Peter, Apollos, or any of those guys. Now, what's the problem? Well, Pastorology obviously makes a pastor way too important. Paul says in verse 5, what then is Apollos? What then is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. He who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive his wages according to his labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building. What's the point? Who's doing the verbs? God's doing the verbs. Yes, he works through Paul's, and he works through Apollos', and he works through your pastor, and he works through a John MacArthur, and he works through a me, and he works through a you. And yes, this is what God does, but ultimately, God deserves all of the credit, all of the glory. You see, it's really not a good thing on any side of the equation when a pastor is given too much status or too much importance. On the one hand, if a pastor sort of feels that, wants to be the person that seems to get all that seems to have all the authority, well, then I guarantee you he will become a proud man and will become off balance. And at the same time, if people put him in that place, well, it's a burden that he can never, ever, ever carry. It's a burden that no one can carry but Christ alone. No, we ought to recognize the pastor's place, and we'll talk about that in just a second because the word Paul uses for servant here is very, very important. But before that, I want to highlight one of my favorite paintings throughout all of history, and it's a painting by Van Gogh. Yes, that Van Gogh. And it's called The Sower, and I'm convinced that it was probably a painting made after meditating on the parable of the sower. If you look at the painting, one of the things you'll notice is that there is a man throwing seed, like somebody sowing seed in a field, and yet the man is faceless. You do not see the man. And I'm convinced the reason that Van Gogh painted the painting that way is to emphasize that the seed is what's important, and the man is not of any importance at all. He is merely the sower. I have held this painting up before me throughout all my years of ministry as a model for what I would want to be. I just want to be a faceless person sowing the important thing, the seed that actually brings the growth. And that seed, of course, is the Word of God. That's what Paul is saying here. That's what Paul is telling the Corinthians. Who cares who your pastor is? Who cares how eloquent he is or how awesome he is or how amazing he is? The pastor doesn't deserve the credit and the glory. No, that goes to Jesus alone. Why is that? Well, because it turns out pastors are really no different than just table waiters for Jesus. The word for servant that Paul uses in Greek is diakonai, and that word was used to describe waiters at dining establishments back in the day. The point is not to denigrate pastors or to look down on pastors. I mean, I'm ordained as a pastor, my friends, so I hope that you would understand I'm not talking smack about pastors. But it's indeed to put us in our proper context. A pastor merely sows seed, merely waters, but God brings the growth in people's life. The pastor is just a person with a vocation to teach and preach the Word, and the Word is the power. Few people understood this better than the writer and pastor Eugene Peterson. He wrote a book towards the end of his life called The Pastor that really described the pastor as being somebody that had a ho-hum job, that he was just supposed to go out, be faithful in his calling, and then go back home and, and really, kind of be in the background. And I love that picture, even though it's not always easy to follow that picture because pastors are prone to wanting glory just as much as anybody else. A third problem with Pastorology is that it tends to stunt the church's growth. Now, I'm going to read verses 10 through 15, and you're going to maybe not pick up on why I say this relates to stunting the church's growth, but stick with me. Paul says, according to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation, and someone else is building upon it. Let each one take care how he builds upon it. For no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work that anyone has built, has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire. Now, a couple of things. You've probably heard this passage quoted out of context before to talk about how our works will, even if we don't have that many great works as Christians, that somehow we'll still be saved because of the faith that we have in Jesus. That is true, but that's not what this passage is about. We always have to read passages in their context, and here Paul is talking about their willingness to divide over famous pastors. No, I think this is related to that. This is related to people dividing over pastors. And it's, if I can summarize it, it's them not willing to trust the process. It's them not willing to say, hey, look, it was great that we had Paul for a little while that laid the foundation. And you know what? We really love Apollos and what he did afterwards. And whoever the next person is, or maybe we have the next person is here, we're gonna know that God is working through that person too, even if their works might look a little bit more like straw than like gold, even if they're not quite as impressive as the old Apostle Paul was or Apollos. We're going to trust that God's working in this person too, even if they're different, even if their gifts are different. In other words, they're being called to trust in the process, that when God calls a new pastor or a new person to this church, even if they're not as flashy or not as gifted or just different, that God is still working in that person. Now, again, this isn't a justification for a pastor who's teaching heresy or is doing things to divide the church unnecessarily. That's a different issue. But if it's just a matter of, eloquence or charisma or that kind of thing, that's not something that we divide over. No, this is something that we trust that God is in. We do what the 76ers fans were asked to do for years. Yes, I know this is an inside basketball saying, but we're going to trust the process no matter what. Now, Pastor Olatry. Again, the problem is it doesn't allow this process. Either the pastor is seen as the one who does everything in the church's life, or the pastor is seen as above accountability from the church. Both of those positions are not biblical and are unhealthy. And so the result is a church with stunted growth, and Paul doesn't want that for the Corinthians. Once again, another problem with Pastorology is it makes the church susceptible to charlatans. Look at what Paul writes in verse 16. Again, this is all in the context of them sort of dividing over who is their pastor, who they follow. Verse 16, do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is holy and you are that temple. Now, I believe what is being hinted at here by Paul is the potential destructive nature of idolizing the pastor. If you idolize a pastor, then it's way too easy to fall for just the gifts of a pastor or gifts of the person who's calling himself a pastor, whether that person is actually someone worthy of following and actually pointing you to Jesus. People can so look up to the person's abilities that it can easily make room for charlatans that just have the abilities but aren't actually being led by the Spirit to point you to Jesus Christ. And I think Paul is concerned about that in the Corinthian church. Remember, this is a church that is prone to running after gifts and charisma, as he will rebuke them for later on in this writing. So all of these are problems with Pastor Olatry, and he is calling the church out. He is kind of nailing them. I mean, he calls them infants, and he calls them fleshly. And yet that doesn't change their status. I mean, again, we need to go back to the first chapter where Paul addresses them as sanctified and as saints, and yet he says they're not acting saintly when they do this. And that is always possible for the church, that we are indeed saints, we are justified freely on account of Jesus Christ, and yet we're off balance in any number of areas, and we do need to be rebuked, and we do need to hear that when we fall into that trap, and that's what Paul is doing here. And yet the biggest problem with Pastor Olatry, the main problem in all of this, is it takes the focus off of Jesus and puts it on the pastor. And we never, ever, ever want to do that because Christ is better. Always, your pastor, no matter who they are, is a flawed human being. And they need to be understood as such. Yes, they've been given a position to do something that is very, very significant, to preach the gospel to you and administer the sacraments. It is huge. And yet they are going to let you down. I promise you. I've let plenty down throughout all of my years as a pastor, and I'm sure it will happen again. It happens to everybody because they're flawed. The only one who's not flawed is the true and better shepherd who can forgive us of our Pastorology and forgive pastors for not living up to their calling too. So Paul says at the end of chapter 3, so let no one boast in men, for all things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or the present or the future. All are yours, and you are Christ's, and Christ is God's. The point is, for Paul, he wants the Corinthian church to look to Christ because he is the only one who lived perfectly for them. He is the only one who died in your place. He is the only one powerful enough to raise from the dead. He is the only one who rules and reigns now, interceding on your behalf. No pastor, no matter how good he may be, and I pray that all of them are good, has ever done anything close to that for you. So don't look to the pastor. Look to Christ, the one who may empower the pastor to bring you the good news about Christ, so that you would not be let down, but instead be filled with hope each and every day that he is enough for you, for me, and for the world. All right, folks, that's it for this week's Law and Gospel Devotional. I hope that that's an encouragement to you, and I just want to encourage you again to go over to www.1517.org/donate and join us in our adventure on Giving Tuesday. We sure appreciate it. May God richly bless you. We'll see you next week. God bless.